Yeah, and we got the Fed, as you mentioned, overnight, hiking rates by half a point, sounding less hawkish than what was initially expected. And all that, of course, to tame inflation in the U.S. The thing, though, here in Asia, inflation is really not as bad as what it is in the U.S. But do you think Asian central bankers will now feel more pressure to follow and tighten as well in line with the major central banks?
Well, I think Asia's been singing to a different tune, to be frank, in recent months. Asia hasn't had necessarily the pressure to raise rates. As you said, inflation's been somewhat lower in the region. But that said, central banks are shifting now. And we had, for example, yesterday, the Reserve Bank of India hiking in a surprise move by 40 basis points and will likely continue to hike in the months ahead. Other central banks in the region, such as the Bank of Korea, the MAS in Singapore, are also shifting more aggressively towards tightening. So I think it's a matter of time, and I do expect central banks in this region to continue with a tightening cycle, and they will, of course, be pushed along by higher U.S. rates.
Yeah, and the Fed hikes that we got from the U.S. is in a bid to tame inflation, but it doesn't really address the factors that are causing this high prices. What it does, though, is affect U.S. demand. What does that mean then for the rest of the world, really? And what does that mean for the prospects of a global recession ahead?
Well, I think the Fed is in a tough position here. They have to try and get this landing in the U.S. to be a soft one rather than pushing the economy into recession. I think yesterday's Fed statement and Fed actions seem to be moving in that direction. You know, there's the fears that they would hike 75 basis points. They didn't. Now, of course, a weaker U.S. trajectory, which is what is likely in the months ahead. And you noted quite well that clearly some of these factors on inflation are supply side issues due to supply pressures. But demand is also a factor. And if the Fed hikes will at least reduce some of the demand that's been strengthening and perhaps dampen inflation, that will bode well. But the economy could tip into recession. It's not our central scenario, but a weaker U.S. growth trajectory will certainly impact global economies, given, and certainly this region, a weaker demand for Asian exports is something we do expect in the months ahead.
Yeah, and now that the Fed isn't as hawkish as initially expected, do you expect some weakness in the U.S. dollar? Because if that happens, that could help the inflation picture for Asia.
I think the dollar clearly has benefited from higher U.S. yields and, of course, the relative strength in the U.S. economy. Historically, of course, the dollar weakens in the months following the beginning of Fed tightening. It hasn't done that yet. But already it was interesting overnight that the Fed didn't move by 75 and they still moved by 50 basis points. And yet the dollar weakened. So I think a weaker dollar will help this region, of course. I think it's probably too early to call a peak in the dollar just yet, but I would imagine that the dollar will weaken in the months ahead, and that will benefit Asian markets, Asian currencies. Stronger Asian currencies will also help with regard to inflation, imported inflation pressures into this region. So I think that is a trajectory we expect. But again, it's like catching a falling knife. At this point, the dollar still looks very, very firm.
And really quickly, before we let you go, Mitul, where do you then see value in Asian equities?
Well, I think at this point in time, you've got to be still very careful about sort of growth. If we look what's happening in the US, growth stocks have been hit the most, the interest rate sensitive stocks. So really, I think it's a case of steering away from the growth sector more towards defensive areas of the stock market. And I think, again, there's question marks as well on China and the regulatory picture there. Many people still think Chinese stocks are undervalued, but again, a lot depends on stimulus. So I think for now, it's a defensive approach that investors are probably taking with regard to equities in Asia.
All right. Thanks for your insights, Mitul, on a key day for Asia and the world. Mitul Kotecha there, Chief Emerging Markets, Asia and Europe Strategist at TD Securities.